doors open.
Just to see what she
Leave the
thinks.
door open. Just under the house. You should close the door.
Yeah. It's interesting.
Yeah.
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 I do too.
Hi. I think we'll start. I'm not sure there'll be other people coming in. I think that that's what usually happens. People sort of come in and drift out, but we can try to ignore the extra noise. I'm Mary Ellen Butke, and
I'm Nora Reed.
we're supposed to be talking today about counseling the adoptee to search or not. And we are going to be talking some about the title and as well as clinical issues in the search process. And you'll hear as we go along why we're sort of shifting the focus a bit about that. We're each going to tell you a little bit about ourselves and then a little bit about what we're going to be talking about. And we'll go from there. And I think what we'd like to do is to first present some of the material that we have. We probably have a good 45 minutes or so to present, and then to really have some audience participation, perhaps talk about cases or folks that people are working with or whatever would be most helpful for the group. Certainly, though, if you want a point to be clarified or have to say something, jump in. So don't. It's a small group too, so we can make it relatively informal in that respect. I'm a clinical social worker, and I work at a child and adolescent psychiatric hospital in Rhode Island. And I've been working with and I'm also an adoptee who's searched for 6 years and was reunited about a year and a half ago with my birth family, and have been having a reunion since that time. So my interest in adoption is personal and professional. And I also have a private practice, which is mostly adult clients, many of whom are adoption involved in some way. And I also am the co-president of a search and support group in the Rhode Island area. So come to adoption through a number of different channels, and I think obviously some of that will impact on what my thoughts are and have to say today about things. So.
I also am an adoptee who's not exactly had a reunion, and that'll be part of what I talk about. I have completed a search, probably the best way to put it. I work at an adoption agency most of the time. I have worked as a coordinator of post-adoption services at one agency, and I do some of that at the agency I'm working at, but I wanted to have more experience working in the initial stages of adoption as well. So I do a lot of birth parent counseling. I do some post-relinquishment work with birth parents. I do some home studies. I do a little bit of everything because I really wanted to have kind of the entire life cycle of adoption experience. I also have a very small private practice, and I mainly do work with people who are coming back as adults, all members of the triad, including adoptive parents, in which we explore some of the issues that they need to deal with, but don't want to deal with through a traditional adoption agency. I'm program director of Adoptee Birth Parent Support Network, which is our search and support group in Washington, D.C. area. I don't know what else to say. I guess, again, it's a personal and professional interest that I have. I never intended to get into it professionally, but you always work on your own issues, I think, in any kind of work that you do. And I really have felt that it's been a good choice for me. It's been just a very kind of cohesive thing to do with my life. And I'm going to be talking about some clinical issues, but mainly the issues that are raised and the use of myself as a post-adoption counselor in a traditional adoption agency. And dealing with issues of search, pre-search, post-search, not just the actual event of searching.
The other interesting thing I was thinking when Nora was talking is that Nora was one of the social workers at the agency where my information was, so that's part of our connection. And sort of curious that we're presenting together.
And Mary Ellen
today.
went to the school where I formerly taught, so it's this ghetto that we live in called Washington, D.C.
Georgetown Visitation Preparatory School for young women of the Catholic faith, so you can see that we're both very so inclined.
Surrounded by brick walls.
Exactly.
We managed to break free.
Right. About 6 months ago, I had spoken with Susan Miller Havens about presenting at this conference, and we had talked about a number of different topics and what I would be interested in doing, and we had a long conversation about it, which I subsequently forgot. And about 2 months ago, got the brochure for the conference and was excited to open it up and see my name in print, which is always fun. And I saw next to my name was counseling the adoptee to search or not, and I panicked and thought, I didn't agree to this. They made this up. I mean, who's doing this? You know, what's the story? And for a couple different reasons, I said I have nothing to say about this topic for a couple different reasons. One is because, I mean, not to be sort of elitist or whatever, but I don't consider necessarily what I do to be counseling per se, but it feels more like psychotherapy. It's clinical work. And the second reason is that when I thought of counseling the adoptee to search or not, that really offended me in a certain way, and that I don't think it's my decision to influence anybody about their search process. And I think that each of us is unique and individual, and each client that I see is going to be unique in that sphere, and that it's not I can't put my values on them about whether or not they should search, or whether or not I think it's in their best interest to search. So after I got over my initial shock, I thought that would actually be an interesting thing for us at some point to maybe talk about, is that how does our own stuff influence our work with clients? And I'm assuming that some people here are clinicians, and if not, members of the tribe, and I think hopefully it will be interesting for everyone. But a big piece of what I'll be talking about today will be clinical issues. I'm going to talk some this morning about, this afternoon, I don't know when it is, I've been on a plane all morning, about doing this work and about adoptees' motivations to search, and then also obviously about clinical issues, use of fantasy material, transference, countertransference, some of the issues that come up most times when I'm working with clients around search, issues of grief and loss, issues of anger and rage. And both of us have a lot of case examples, so maybe after we finish the didactic piece, we can go on to really talk some about cases and share some people have dilemmas or things that they're working on. And I think I want to start with talking about our own attitudes and our own biases regarding the search and regarding some of the work that we do. And I was talking with some colleagues the other day about in preparation for coming here, and they're not involved with adoption. And they said, well, you have an opinion, you're completely pro-search, and you would probably influence your clients around search. And that I realized that was true, and that in some ways I need to be therapist first and adoptee second in the room with my clients, and that in some ways that certainly it's their decision about whether or not they search. And I have to be really aware all the time about my own attitudes and values and opinions and what I'm putting on my clients. And I think that in some ways it's very helpful to have an adoptee as a therapist, to have a person who really understands what the issues are like. But I think it also can be a challenge for us in terms of some of our own issues that come up if we're involved in adoption. The other thing I thought about and thinking about as clinicians, that I think that the best that we can do is hope to be a guide for people along their path, and hopefully we'll be a respectful guide and a guide that listens to people and helps people really discover what they want and who they are in the process. And also after years of thinking about the title, also after years of trying to control other people's behavior, after growing up with an alcoholic family, I realized that I don't want to do that anymore. So I don't want to help people decide, or I don't want to decide for them whether or not they should search. I reviewed a lot of the literature on search in preparation for this talk, and one of the things I found about people's talking about search in the literature was that there was often sort of okay motivations for search and not okay motivations for search. And a lot of things that were talked about, there were little quotes I wrote down, like some people having an obsessive urge to search, or that it was neurotic, working out their neurotic issues, or other things. And again, so our own, or these writers' own values. And that certainly there are some motivations that people have that are okay and others that aren't okay. And I think that that's important for us to talk about. The other thing is, when I'm talking about search, I think most of us are thinking about, and I also think about the concrete, the literal searching for or seeking out one's family of origin when we're talking about the adoptee. And as I've come to realize over a couple of years of practicing, particularly with adoptees and adoption-related cases, is that I think the search can really be a number of different things, including there can be emotional and psychological searches, whether or not a client ever really pursues finding out more information. That I think in some ways the search for more information, or the search in adoption, also encompasses really a search for self. And so I think that that's an important piece of the process. So I don't want to just generalize it to working with clients who are in the process of finding their birth families, because I think that search encompasses more than that. Okay. What have people said about motivations for search, or what have we all heard about motivations for search? I think that there are certainly politically correct answers and non-politically correct answers, and it just depends on which circle you're sitting in about what's okay and what's not okay. A story that I have around that is that anybody who knows me knows that I've been an avid pro-search sort of fanatic for the past 6 years, and that's sort of a piece of my identity as an adoptee and in the community. And it hasn't always been true. And about 8 years ago, I met up when I was in college with an adoptee who I remember having a conversation with, and she was in the process of searching at that time. And she and I had a fine conversation. I don't remember it, and it seemed nice at the time. And about a year later, I made a decision to do something very different from what my adoptive family wanted me to do, and I was panicked about being cut off from them at that point. And at that point, I think partly motivated by that, I decided to initiate a search for my birth family. And once I get into something, I'm into it. So I was very involved in my search after I initiated it. About a year after that, I ran into the same woman who I'd run into in college. And I told her I was searching in this very delighted way. And she looked at me in shock and said, "You're searching?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm searching and I'm into it and this is great and isn't this wonderful?" And she said, "Do you remember what you said to me 2 years ago when I first met you?" And I couldn't remember. And she said that I had said to her that I wasn't at all interested in searching, and that I thought it would be much too hurtful to my adoptive family, and that the only reason I would ever want to search would be to reassure my birth mother that she really did the right thing in relinquishing me. And I mean, for me to have said that was, I couldn't believe, I said, "Are you sure that I said, are you making this up?" Because it's so not the me that I know now. And so it's very curious to me that we all, at different points along the way, I think, or adoptees at different points along the way, have different motivations, or at some point may be completely not interested, and then at other points be really riveted by the search. So motivations to search. I think that the politically correct answer, oftentimes when dealing with agencies or dealing with people in the outside world who really don't understand, is looking for medical information. Now, what is more benign than looking for medical history, right? I mean, it's so boring, too. I mean, who would spend, like, thousands of dollars and years of their life trying to... I mean, it's important, and I'm not trying to minimize it, because I do... I mean, it's awful to go to a doctor and not have any information, but I think it's really a piece of the story, and that there's a much bigger part of the story. But that's sort of one of those benign answers that legislators or other folks can't really argue with. So we can... that's not a complicated issue. I've also had a number of people say to me that they want to search to reassure birth parents, and that's really their motivation for searching. And it's a very sort of altruistic, goal and wish. And again, I think that can be part of the story for many people, but I don't believe that that's the whole story either. I think that there's many layers and many facets of what the story is. And that's also not as controversial at all to say that. Another reason oftentimes that people talk about the need for history, a need for a sense of belonging to, blood relatives, a sense of identification with another, to see someone who looks like me, to know that I'm not a freak. I know for me, I have size 12 foot, which for women is very large. And I'm almost 5'11", and my adopted mother is 4'10". And you look pretty odd when you're taller than her when you're 6, and when you can't buy shoes in the regular shoe store. And when I found out that my birth father was 6'3" and had size 13 feet and was a basketball player, it was like, right, that makes sense. And just that sense of connection, or of identification with another. I have a client who I worked with, and the first day I met her, I knew that she was an adoptee, and I often ask my adopted clients and my non-adopted clients, but to describe themselves to me. How do they see themselves? What do they think about their personality, their body, their face, what they look like? And the first words out of her mouth when asking her this question was, "I hate my nose, I hate my nose, I hate my nose." She had a very unusual, sort of large, sort of pushed-in nose. It wasn't an ugly nose, but it was a very unusual nose. And she went on to say, "I've always hated my nose. I've never seen this nose on anybody else's face besides mine." And then went on, of course, to say that she imagined that her birth mother had the same nose, and when they found each other, they would connect, and she would then see somebody's nose that looked like her. But I think that it's that in lacking that concrete identification, adoptees often judge themselves as if there's something wrong or defective or not okay with the way they look or their skills or what they're like. The other issue around motivation for searching, just something that I want to read to you, which I think is really interesting. There's been articles written that say, why do adoptees search, and what are adoptees' motivations for searching? And the question is sort of asinine to me in some ways. And I think, why don't we ask the question, why don't adoptees search? Why is it that the adoptee who searches is more open target for interpretation and pathologizing, perhaps, as opposed to the person that's not searching? I don't think it's right to pathologize folks who aren't searching either, but I think that even the questions are interesting. And there's an article by Robert Anderson, who actually I saw speaking today too, on why adoptees search, motivations, and more. And I want to read you this quote because I think it's interesting. What then about the question as to why the adoptee is searching? This question, I believe, can be paraphrased as thus. Why are you interested in your mother, your father, your grandparents, brothers, sisters, cousins, nephews, nieces, ancestry, history, proclivities, aptitudes, liabilities? In short, why are you interested in you? To this question, the adoptee gives a direct, unquestioned response. Why? Is this not an absurd question? How does it differ from any of the questions above? The search question does not demand a response, at least not an informational one. Are you out of your mind? Might be an appropriate response, but not, I'm interested in finding out some medical history so that I might be better able to monitor the health of my newborn child. How timid, how differential adoptees are. How low is their sense of legitimacy that they may have to offer up such absurdities in view of such an affront. This is the tragedy that adoptees, more often than not, do not feel justified in living life as it is, but have to come up with socially acceptable excuses to justify our interests, needs, and lives. They cannot be honest with themselves or others because the conflictual forces, external if in the form of, how could you do this to your adoptive parents, or internal if in the form of, she gave me up and I do not want to give her the satisfaction of knowing that it matters, interfere with the living of life from their own authentic position. And I thought that this was really sort of encapsulated the piece about why adoptees search, or talking about it. And certainly I think it's important, clinically, for us to explore people's motivations for whatever they do, sort of our work and our life's work. But I think that we need to keep some of that in mind in terms of again, what our thoughts or our interpretations might be put on to clients about that. Okay. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about, some around issues of motivation for search, are issues of identity development. And certainly all of us know Erik Erikson's work and folks talking about identity development and issues that come up, particularly in adolescence, about identity. And I think some of this is really tied in with issues of searching and with identification. Erikson in 1967 wrote, the problem of identity is that it must establish a continuity between society's past and future, and that adolescence in all its vulnerability and power is the critical transformer of both. And certainly we think of vulnerability in terms of the adoptee. The adoptee doesn't really have that connection with the past or connection necessarily with the future. And I think that leaves particularly adopted adolescents at a real vulnerable point in terms of trying to find that sense of identity or who they are. Also, Herlock in 1955 states that until the individual establishes a stable concept of self, he will be uncertain about his ability, his status in the group, and how he compares with others. Those with stable self-concepts have higher levels of self-esteem. So then we have to ask ourselves, how do kids develop self-concept? What's that about, that development of their sense of themselves? And I believe that some of that begins to develop in infancy, and that's certainly what the literature talks about. Melanie Klein contends that the infant has an awareness of the mother from the earliest weeks, and that by the age of 3 or 4 months has developed a sense of trust and mistrust in relation to her. Later, by the 5th or 6th month, the infant has developed a sense of security or insecurity. And if we think about that in relation to the adoptee, in relation to when the adoptee is placed, and what that early climate is like, and there's an infant's sense of basic trust and mistrust, we can begin to think about how that might have implications for issues about self-concept. In addition, I think that part of self-concept is formed when kids are growing up and they can look at people who look like them, both parents and then the extended network, aunts, uncles, even if they can't find an identification in their immediate family, they can often find an identification in a kinship network. And for adoptees, again, that's really lacking, and I think that has some implications for how adoptees view themselves or adoptees' sense of themselves. Okay. And to illustrate this point, I want to read something to you, a story that obviously everybody has heard before and knows, but I think it makes a particularly interesting point, and particularly around the issues of identification, and that what we can't see in ourselves reflected in somebody else is oftentimes put up as not okay in some way, or as deformed, or as bad, or as not like the other. And this is a story by Hans Christian Andersen, The Ugly Duckling. And it's from an article on genealogical bewilderment in children with substitute parents. Okay. In this story, as people know, it's a swan deprived of knowledge of the swan's genealogy by being hatched in a duck's family. The swan is rejected because he cannot do what the others in the family can do as a result of his different genetic endowment. Persecution leads to depression and wandering, symptoms often found in the genealogically bewildered child. At one time, the young swan is fostered by an old woman who already has 2 other foster children, a cat and a hen. The cat despises him because he cannot curve his back and purr, and the hen because he cannot lay eggs. The ugly duckling's heredity at this stage of development allows him only to claim swimming as one of his abilities. He ventures to say, as many foster children or adoptees have done, that his foster family do not understand him, and is told by the hen, "You've got nothing to do, that's why you get these whimsies. You try laying eggs or purring and you'll get over it. We don't understand you, don't we? Thank your master for all the kindness people have shown you. Haven't you got a nice warm room to live in and company from which you can learn a thing or two? I'm talking to you for your own good, and when people tell the unpleasant truth, then you get to know who your real friends are." The ugly duckling then does what other foster children have done before. He runs away out into the wide world. One afternoon he sees some birds which strangely inspire him. They are swans, but he does not know that. He has never seen such beautiful birds, but is not jealous of them. He encounters further rejections and hardships, but then suddenly finds he can flap his wings more strongly than ever before, and that he can fly. Then once more he meets some swans. The ugly duckling recognizes the beautiful animals, and a feeling of strange sadness comes over him. He fears they may kill him, but he does not care. He must join them. "Please kill me," said the poor little creature, and meekly stretched his neck along the water and waited for death. But what do you suppose he saw in the clear water? He saw his own image, but it was no longer that of a clumsy, dirty, gray bird, ugly and awkward, but of a lovely swan. Doesn't matter at all being born in a duck yard if you come out of a swan's egg. And this, for me, really encapsulated what it's like to search and what it's like to find, and to really then have a reflection in somebody else of who we are, and an image of that. And I think this is relevant, really relevant for adoptees, because it points out that, again, the difficulties that kids have to face in not having that identification. And this can take a lot of different forms. I think looks are the most evident forms. And if we think about things like transracial, cultural adoption, certainly this is a major issue, but it comes out in subtler ways, and kids being adopted into the same race or even same ethnic culture, that there's not this same kind of identification. It also, from what I've seen, comes out in issues of intelligence. If a kid is growing up in a family where perhaps they're not as bright or brighter than the adopted family, where intelligence is valued or not, or education is valued or not, and the kid can often feel really out of place. If they're brighter or academically more gifted, they can feel like a fraud growing up. If they're not as bright academically, and that's something that the family values, they can see themselves as stupid, and really they can certainly tie into concepts of their low self-esteem. It often comes up, I think, with skills and aptitude, and also in how kids and adolescents choose to act out. Now, as clinicians, I think we've all seen, if we see families, we all see families where, biological families, where family comes in with an adolescent, say, boy or girl who's completely acting out and running away, or maybe pulled a fire alarm at school, or got drunk, or whatever, and you're with this family where the kid was born to them, and you say, does this remind you of anybody else? Did anybody else in this family do this as an adolescent? And the father says, well, I sort of did the same thing. Yeah, he's kind of a chip off the old block, and that there's some identification between father and son, or mother and daughter, or mother and son, about those kind of issues. And I think that oftentimes with adoptees, the parents can't say about the kid that he or she is a chip off the old block. And I think that sometimes when that occurs, it can be seen as much more dysfunctional than the behavior actually is. And certainly adoptive parents' fantasies about who the birth parents are can play into that. I know I have a number of adoptive families that I work with where they really believe as their kids start to act out, say a kid stole, I don't know, something from a store. And if I meet with the adoptive parents alone, I can often hear them, they often tell me things about, I don't know anything about his background. What if his parents were thieves? What if his father was at the prison? And that sometimes things can really be embellished to the point that with biological kids and families just wouldn't be the same kind of issue. And I think that's really important to do reality testing around that with families about how big is this issue and really what is it that's going on. And also I've seen this mismatch issue cause actual disruption in adoption when kids are adolescents. I work in the outpatient department of a child and adolescent psychiatric hospital, but I also have occasion to consult on cases in the inpatient units. And oftentimes there's adoptees that end up as psychiatrically hospitalized when really their issues are not in the same realm as other kids, but the behavior is so out of sync with what the adoptive family would ever have done in their lives that it looks really foreign, and the kid ends up being hospitalized and sometimes even disadopted is my term that my teenagers have come up with to talk about that, because it's just too foreign and they can't keep that connection because they need to disown that behavior of that person. Another story about that in terms of identification is a client that I'm seeing now. I'm going to call him Pete, and whenever we are talking about clinical material, we've changed stories around a bit and also are obviously changing names to protect people's privacy. Pete's being raised in an upper middle class family, and he was hospitalized because of some pretty severe acting out and oppositional behavior. And as part of my work with him, when he was in the hospital, he told me the story about what it was like to grow up in his family, and he's growing up in an upper middle class family. They have a regular house, they have a winter house up north and a summer house at the beach, and he's very embarrassed by the fact that he's being raised in an upper middle class family. He thinks that's a very shameful thing for him. And he goes on to say that he really believes that his birth parents were of working class origins. And he seeks out in his school the kids who are of working class origins as well. And he told me that he tells them this story, that he's really not from upper middle class stock. He doesn't tell them that he's an adoptee, but he says that his family, his father several years ago struck it rich in New York City. They were very poor, and his father made a great business break, and that they then could move to this very nice neighborhood and very wealthy place. And but that his roots are really in Harlem, and that's where his life is. And that every weekend when he goes away, which really he's going to the winter house or the beach house, that he's really going back to Harlem to visit his best friend, Jamil. And Jamil is this big black adolescent male who he's best friends with, and they cruise the neighborhood, and the worst thing they do is smoke and go to pool halls, and that Jamil protects them and makes up these stories to tell these kids because that's what he wants his identification to be. He doesn't go so far as to wonder, he's a very white-looking kid, he doesn't go so far as to wonder whether or not he's in fact a kid of color, but I wonder if that's a piece also of what's going on with him, of really not knowing what his ethnicity is. But it's fascinating that he both fantasizes about that and in fact feels much more comfortable living that out than living out what he was adopted into. The other issue I just want to raise around motivation for search that I think is less talked about, and that also even at adoption conferences I think we talk about less because it's more sort of scary, or can we really be talking about this, is that in my work and in the support group that I run, I really believe that some of us search for parents and some of us search for a mother and father, and usually people, that's really not okay as much to talk about because we're adults and we've been raised with a mother and father and they're our, quote, real parents. But I think for many of us who were raised in families where there wasn't adequate parenting, or where there was abuse and neglect in some way, or where there wasn't really adequate attachment or bonding, or perhaps where the adoptee held out, really believing that at some point the birth parent would come back to get them. So they let themselves attach to some degree, but really didn't let themselves be in that family. That those adoptees, some of us can really be holding out for the real McCoy. And I think that we need to not see this as pathological. It needs to be explored, it needs to be talked about, and the reality of what can happen in that reunion needs to obviously be addressed, but that it's also important not to pathologize that might be one of the motivations for people searching. And there's also, I think, a real desire sometimes for adoptees to recreate what was lost, to get back what was lost, and to heal the trauma. This goes out. To undo the trauma of the separation. And I think that in a lot of ways, in my experience, that search for people is very healing. It's a very powerful way for people to really heal. And again, to search for themselves and their sense of themselves as time goes on. I also just want to address, why do adoptees sometimes temper their requests? I mean, something that that Anderson was talking about. And I think many of us, at least at the initial stages of our searches, do temper what we ask for. And I think that a lot of that is because we're often well trained to give the least offensive answers. And there's something implicit about when people ask about, why are you searching? And I think that people have often heard things like, after all your adoptive parents have done for you, or how could you go look for her, she has a new life. The other thing that people often ask is, what if you find something horrendous? What if you find rape? What if you find incest? And I think it's very curious that that's brought up a lot. And I'm going to be actually talking about a case example where the young woman is a product of incest and found that, and has recently had been reunited with both of her birth parents. And I think that for adoption workers particularly, but for social workers, that can be sort of the worst case scenario. And people often ask me, isn't it better for the kid not to know? And what I often say in response, what I always say in response, is that we all fantasize about the worst anyway. So things, usually adoptees are not going to find things they haven't already thought about or fantasized about. And I'll be talking about that a little bit more when I talk about fantasy. We don't have time, okay. Okay. I want to get some of the treatment issues and some of what comes up in treatment, and we can also dialogue some more about this. But I think the search for a client, working with a client when they're searching, is a wonderful opportunity to really explore their lifetime of what adoption's meant to them, and issues of their thoughts, feelings, fantasies regarding their birth parents people are very ripe at that time to talk about that. And I think the fantasy material in particular is very rich and gives us windows of opportunity into clients' inner world and inner life. And the fantasies, from what I have seen, often change over time. So if you ask clients to go back and talk about what their fantasies as a 5-year-old were in comparison to what they were as a latency child, as an adolescent, and now as an adult, you'll often see a real either progression or shifting or going back and forth among different possibilities. And usually the fantasies seem to say something about the other, about the birth family, and also about the self. And you'll find material about both of those, I think, as you explore the fantasy material. And there's really a range of possibilities, and I think that we need to look for the layers. That usually, when I first ask a client about what their fantasy is about their birth family, they'll tell me the pat answer that they grew up with, like, she was too young and couldn't care for me, or they couldn't take care of a child, or they didn't have enough money, or some sort of straightforward basic answer. And then as you explore more and more, there seem to be layer after layer after layer of fantasy material. Oftentimes the birth mother is seen as either all good, or the birth parents as either all good or all bad. Something that is pretty commonly talked about. And frequently the adoptee sees themselves as bad, defective, unwanted, a throwaway. And kids come up with these ideas all on their own. I do a lot of talking for adoptive parents groups, and they say, can't we not have our child think that there's something wrong with them and that's why they got given up? If we just say the right thing, if we just do the right thing, won't they not have to feel that? I don't think that there's certainly, there's ways to highlight some of the defectiveness or whatever if you really say awful things to your kid, but for the most part I think kids come up with some of that all on their own. Kids have said such things to me, and adults as, I must have cried too much, that was why she left me. I was an ugly baby. If you saw my pictures, you would have understood why I got given away. I was a burden. I was sickly. When they got me, I was really sick. I was close to death. Or I'm the product of a failed abortion. She would have had an abortion if it was legal back then, but she couldn't, so here I am. And I've even had some clients, before they were consciously aware of it, actually try to act that fantasy out by attempting or even contemplating or even attempting suicide as a way to sort of complete this belief, this internal inner drive that there's something so defective about them and that in fact they would have been aborted if they hadn't been, if abortion had been legal at that time. I think fantasizing allows adoptees to really try to come to terms with their status, and in fact it's really obviously important for adoptees to be able to use their fantasy material. But one of the things I found, which is interesting, is that some adoptees seem to fantasize, overly fantasize. Adoptees in latency and young adolescents are often misdiagnosed with attention deficit disorder because of the fact that they are constantly preoccupied with fantasy material. And I think, again, in the absence of real information, kids tend to fantasize. The other thing that I've seen is the other extreme, where kids really shut off their fantasy life, or adults shut off their fantasy life altogether because the thought of fantasizing is too painful. Because fantasizing about the birth family, I think sometimes leaves the adoptees feeling like the possibilities are too difficult and the affect generated is too overwhelming for them to deal with. So sometimes you really see kids staying very much in the here and now and won't let themselves or allow themselves to fantasize at all. Okay. The other thing is that certainly in terms of the fantasies about the birth family can be all good or all bad. Mother was a whore or a slut, the product of rape or incest, drug or alcohol involved, mentally ill, dead, or also rich, powerful, famous. I have one young male client who continues to believe that he is the son of Donald Trump. And he says he's kidding, but he says it every time I see him. I said, is that a wish or a fear? Not sure which it is for him. To him, I think that Donald Trump is a rich man, so it seems like a good thing. Okay. The other thing I think that we can't talk about searching or about the treatment of clients who are searching without talking about loss. I think that it's my belief, some people have different thoughts about this, it's my belief that every adoptee has suffered a primary basic loss of the people that were supposed to take care of you. I mean, in the natural order of things, kids are supposed to stay with their biological families. And I think if that doesn't happen, that's a trauma and a loss for the child. Now, if a child is placed at infancy, that loss is often pre-verbal. So it's before the kid has language. So oftentimes the body, I think, holds on to memory. Or the child throughout life and into adulthood may have some sense of being depressed, feeling sadness, despair, hopelessness, and not really be able to attach it to anything specific. You'll ask them if it's adoption related, and it doesn't really fit, or they can't really talk about that, and that we really need to help them to really understand where that sense of real hopelessness or despair comes from, because I think a lot of times, since it does come from a place of not having words, that it's really difficult to identify. The other thing that I've seen a lot, which I just think is fascinating, is that when I've seen clients who go through periods of depression or despair that really seem very unrelated to anything that's going on in their current life. It's just all of a sudden something happens. And what I've found with a lot of my clients is it seems like an anniversary reaction of some sort. Birthdays, of course, we all know, are very often an anniversary reaction for adoptees, where they will become pretty despairing around a birthday or feel like that's such a mixed time for them and not sort of an ambivalent, happy time for them. But I've also seen the period right after a birthday being very difficult for clients, sometimes for months on end. And in exploring that, and then as they get more information about their search, I found that sometimes it's the period of time that they were in an orphanage or in care someplace, or not with their family that they were then going to live with, and that there's some despairing sense about that time. And they can't identify it, they can't put a finger on it, but oftentimes in the work, sometimes in dreams or whatever, it comes back. And if we think about that, if you think about a child being born and then being separated from the person whom they grew in for 9 months, and then being placed sometimes in an institutional setting with no real caretaker, no one primary person, for weeks, sometimes months. And you can imagine the sense of, as Bowlby's studies show, of protest and despair and real, sometimes just then sort of hopelessness about whether anything's going to change or whether they in fact are going to get picked up or held or taken care of. And I think that it's interesting to look for that when you see clients who will go through times of that despair without seeming like it's really connected to anything. Okay. The other thing I wanted to mention about grieving and mourning is that I think that in some ways searching to me is sort of equivalent to grieving or mourning in some way. It can be a very exciting time, it can be a very happy, wonderful time, but I think that each time adoptees find out more information about the birth parent or parents, that there's something concrete to grieve. And then each time, even something so small as she had brown hair, or she had brown eyes, or she was an athlete or whatever, that there's that, it makes the unknown, sort of the fantasy parent into a known, real, living human being, that then the adoptees eventually need to grieve for what was lost. And I think it's very difficult to grieve for what was lost if we don't know what was lost. So a lot of times we'll be working with kids or adolescents or adults who will, again, have this sense of despair or grieving or hopelessness, but they don't have information about what they lost. They know it was these parents, but they don't even have the concrete information. So in some ways, learning more and more through the process of search about who those parents were, I think, can often lead also adoptees to need to grieve each step along the way. And I also think that in finding, regardless of what the outcome is of the search, that there's a lot of grieving that needs to be done on finding. Because for one, the birth parents are never going to be the fantasy parents that any of us hope them to be. And even if they're the best possible option, this is the drawbacks of having it be at the O'Hare Airport.
Well, then the window's open.
In the window's
Just
open.
that's-
Yeah,
Yeah, they
Close
noticed
up a few
that
minutes.
downstairs. Close it.
yeah, we were warm in here before. And I think even if the adoptee finds the best possible birth family when they find, that they need to grieve the fact that they didn't have that time together, that they lost 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years and of that real person that they didn't have growing up. Okay. Thanks. And I included an article in the bibliography, there's a bibliography list over there for people who didn't get that, on how is mourning possible. And it's an article by Martha Wolfenstein, and I won't go into it, you can get it and read it, but that she's actually talking about, can children and adolescents grieve at all, and how do they grieve? And do they grieve differently than adults? And it was mostly talking about kids or adolescents who lose a parent along the way, but I think it has a lot of relevance for adoption, and that in fact it's oftentimes very difficult for kids to really be able to grieve successfully. So a lot of times with our adult clients we'll find that they really need to go back through and do the grieving work that hasn't gotten an opportunity to be done. The other issue that clearly comes up in treatment often is anger and rage, and this can get directed many different places. What's curious is a lot of times during the search process, I've seen the anger or the rage not directed at the birth parents. There's some way that birth parents need to be preserved in that process, that in fact many of my clients have no awareness at all of any anger around being given up or being left. Sometimes that will come after they have the real person to see and meet, and later on they might be able to, once they know the relationship has happened or they found, be able to be angry. But prior to that, a lot of times I really see an absence of the anger, particularly in female clients. More male clients that I work with are more in touch with they're getting pissed about it, but a lot of my female clients are not angry at all, but they're enraged other places. They're enraged at the agency, sometimes they're enraged at you, I mean they're enraged all over the place, and it sometimes seems like, I mean not at the agency, I don't think that's a displacement, but we're going to talk about that later.
It's not displacement at all.
Right, that's real. But so I think that's interesting, that also often comes up. And I think also around issues of transference and countertransference, and we can talk more about this in our discussion, but that oftentimes I found that clients really fantasize or wish for the therapist to be the birth parent, or to be the one that they're seeking out. And that sometimes there's really a parallel process between what's happening in the transference relationship between client and therapist, a parallel to what's happening in the search. And that I think that can come with all its baggage of yearnings and wishings and longings for that person to really take care of them and be there for them and be the person they want them to be. A comparison of the therapist to the fantasized birth parent, and then after finding to the actual birth parent, as well as real, again, anger or rage at the therapist being withholding or not giving the client what they want. And I think in terms of my own countertransference and working with adoptees, kids and adults, it's very difficult for me to not gratify clients in the same way as with other people that I work with, because I know what it feels like to sit on the other side of the chair and to be in the other position. And I also often feel a wish to rescue or to adopt a client that has this wish to have me adopt them, particularly with some of the kids I work with that are in placement getting ready to be adopted. And I also find myself enraged at the system in the same way that I was enraged at the system during my search, sitting with clients where it's all I can do to not say, those fucking assholes, I can't believe they did this. And that, again, we really need to be aware of our own reactions and and sometimes it's appropriate to do that, but our own reactions and our own issues that get stirred up certainly by some of this. The other thing, and I'm going to say one last point and end here, and then actually after both of us end, I have something I wanted to read to you that a client wrote for me to read here. It's the issue about self-disclosure. Nora and I will both be talking about that. I was trained at Smith, which is a pretty psychodynamically oriented place, and we weren't trained to self-disclose about who we are to the client, or if we do, we really need to think about it or obsess about it a lot before we decide to do it. And so my first 2 years in practice, I did not disclose that I was an adoptee. And as I got more and more involved in the movement and began to be on talk shows or do different things, it became more difficult to not disclose. And at the very beginning when I wasn't disclosing, I had worked with a young adolescent girl, who I might talk about later, who was an adoptee, who had been in numerous placements, and she had been in and out of this hospital, a psychiatric hospital, for years of her life. And she and I worked together and explored her fantasies around her birth parents and her searching and everything else. And it was about 3 years after that, after I started to work with her on and off, that she learned from somebody else in the hospital that I was an adoptee. Said, you should go talk to Mary Ellen because she never met before were in psychiatric hospitals. And that hit me like a ton of bricks, and I thought, this is not okay for me to not be a role model in some way, not for me to put my issues into other people's stuff, but for me to say to people, yeah, I have this personal connection with adoption. Doesn't mean that my experience is going to be your experience. And now I take a much different stand about that in terms of some of the clinical work that I do. And she really taught me a lot about that. I think that I'm going to stop. I have more that I could say, chatter on, but I won't. And have Nora start, and then we can have some discussion. So.
I don't have a nice segue into what I do, but sort of want to go over some of the same themes that Mary Ellen did as they apply to what I do. I see people who come to me because they are searching, because they aren't searching, but they want some kind of background information. They think they're not searching. I think that's really search too. Or they don't really know what they want, but they want to be somehow grounded in factual material about their lives. And I often also get referrals from search organizations who rightly tell their clients, go to the agency and see what you can get, and don't be just satisfied with getting something in the mail. Go in person. Somebody sympathetic may, tell you more in person than the agency might allow them to write, which is usually where I am, and I'm, I guess, the legendary sympathetic social worker now, because it seems when I got hired, somehow the caseload instantly increased. Anyway, I usually meet people at a stage where they're really prospective searchers. And getting back to the issue of the topic, I really don't counsel to search or not, but help them explore that decision themselves. I also really never ask about what their motivation is, because I find like the kinds of things that they're likely to tell someone at an agency are all the politically correct responses that Mary Ellen mentioned. And that it's much easier for them to reveal that if they're not asked what their motivation is. It will eventually come out and be probably more honest and more direct as I work with them. Agencies have been really slow to respond well to members of the adoption triad who are coming back post-placement for services. In some ways, I think most agencies have gotten to the point where they accept the fact that building a family through adoption is different from building a family biologically, and that adoption is a lifelong process. But they haven't quite caught up with what the consequences for agency practice are of believing those two things. To me, it seems like if you believe those things, then you have to have the ability to respond to people who, will say, yeah, I want to come back if my 5-year-old has questions, or I want my adolescent to be able to come back, or I want my searching adult children to come back, or birth mothers who want to come back and work on things. In part, I think agencies are defensive because past practice has been so terrible. If you were there this morning listening to Dr. Watson talk about telling birth parents, now you can go on with your lives, or adopted parents being told this is, now we have created a family and you can go on and live happily ever after. Or if you've had occasion to see some of the terrible record keeping that went on years ago, it's understandable why social workers opening files today tend to be pretty defensive about their work with people. And, I kind of feel like I take on the guilt of 20, 30 years ago when I open a file and see that nobody bothered to take any information about health history down, or nobody wrote down a description of what the birth mother looked like, or everything is basically kind of on the back of napkins and index cards and grocery lists. That's just a mishmash of materials. But I think at this point we have to say, okay, that was the past. How can we make things better for people that are coming along today? How can we work with the people whose files are in front of us? And I think, Ann Hartman, who's one of the books that I would add to the bibliography, Working with Adoptive Parents Beyond Placement, talks about our being in a transitional phase at this point, that in a way our feelings and our motivations are to be of service, but we haven't quite got everything in place yet. We are sort of finding our way through whatever we can do. And if you talk to people at different agencies, there's a spectrum of services that are available. There are agencies that are now at the sort of best end of the spectrum, kind of full service agencies that have a regular coordinator of services, who present groups, who have ongoing contact with families that they've placed children with, who have ongoing educational programs, who have a variety of services, who run groups, who just are very creative in their approach to this and very generous and very open about what they offer. And at the other end of the spectrum are the agencies that are extremely defensive, that are very foot-dragging, that make it very difficult to get information of any kind from them, who have a very strict interpretation of what non-identifying information is. Just people who are very, very difficult to work with if you are a triad member coming back. I think the agencies that I've worked with, being an adoptee in that agency, as I'll talk about a little bit later in my presentation, it can be kind of a minefield to walk through, being in a traditional adoption agency and having been social worked by another adoption agency yourself. It's kind of a difficult position to be in. And when I went to social work school, this was not my intention to end up in an adoption agency, although I think it's kind of, I'm still looking for what I want to do when I grow up. But I went with the idea of doing the kind of work that Mary Ellen is doing. I taught school for 15 years and worked with adolescents, and I was interested in working in that age group. And I knew, because of reading that I'd done and experiences that I'd had working at the school, that adoption-related issues were going to be part of that. And I was perfectly comfortable with that. But when I applied to social work school and was applying for my first-year placement, they asked, what kind of setting do you want to be in? And I wrote in big black letters, anything but an adoption agency. And of course, being the wonderful creative school that Catholic University is, I ended up at Catholic Charities Adoption Unit for the next year. And
they're going to make you deal with your issues.
Yeah, they thought they would make me deal with my issues. And ended up feeling really good about being there, and I really saw my sort of hidden agenda for my first year placement there as being an advocate for members of the triad, because the agency at that point was in a real kind of self-searching, well, quasi-self-searching and self-defending kind of mode, where they realized that the floodgates were opening in terms of adoptees, birth parents, adoptive parents coming back, and how do they want to be with this, and how do they want to be with the whole issue of open records. And I had a lot of opportunities that year to kind of normalize the experience of adoption as an adoptee who was at least giving the impression of being fairly high functioning, so that they really didn't see me as pathological and they could kind of hear my story and have it be kind of normal for them. Also had the opportunity to comment on some of the proposed legislation for DC that was coming through the agency, because my supervisor was on the mayor's board to amend adoption legislation, and was at least able to have some impact in striking out the provision that adoptive parents had to give permission for adult adoptees to search. And so there was a lot of advocacy in what I did, and not quite as much client work as I had when I later worked there as a social worker. One of the things that I came across, because I was also doing home studies and am also doing home studies and work with birth parents, is that the most of the literature on adoption talks about entitlement and empowerment as terms that are important in building families, and important to me also in looking at post-adoption clients that are coming back. I find that a lot of the clients that come through not only are giving politically correct, mealy-mouthed kinds of motivations for search, but they are being as eager to please and as unobtrusive as the adoptive parents that I deal with are also trying to be, because they know that the agency has the power to give them a child or not, and the adoptee coming back knows that the agency has the power to withhold or give information that's important to them, that's their information. And so they feel very unentitled, and they feel very unempowered, and it's so I end up seeing before me fairly passive people. And for me as an adoptee, it's very painful to sit there with somebody else's record and know that I have that power, because I've been at the receiving end of that myself. One story I do want to tell at this point in terms of a lack of power. I had a birth mother who came requesting information from her file. And at one point and I was in the room with her with the file, and at one point she started coughing violently, turning red, purple. And so I said, "Would you like a glass of water?" And she nodded yes, that she would. So I went out to get the glass of water for her, and realized as I went out the door, I'd left the file in there. And so I thought, well, hell, that's not my fault. It wasn't deliberate. I didn't, do anything illegal. So I went to get the water, and on my way back I had this fantasy that she had left with the file and my purse and was never going to be seen again. And how was I going to explain this to the agency, who probably on some level didn't trust me anyway, not to do something like that? And I came back in, and the file was where I left it, and she was there still coughing, and I gave her the water. And so I looked at her and I said, "Well, now, did you find out what you needed to know?" Just, I didn't refer to the file. And so she said, "Well, I've got a few more questions." And she asked questions that led me to believe that she hadn't looked at it at all. She hadn't looked at the file. And I said to her, "I was gone long enough for you to look at the file and you didn't look at it?" And she said, "No, I didn't think I was allowed to." And I said, "I feel really sad that whatever happened in your life and whatever this whole experience did to you, that you couldn't do that for yourself." So I left the file facing her, sitting at the table, and we talked another 5 minutes, and she finally looked at it. And the name of her child was this very long Hungarian name with lots of consonants in it. And I said, do you need to write this down or write anything down? Never directly referring to anything. And she said, maybe I'd better. And she did, and she left. And I just felt so terrible for her that she was that, it was just so impossible for her to bring herself to do something that she didn't think she would be allowed to do in the agency. And, it just struck me as being the ultimate worst case of the unempowered, unentitled kind of client. And I thought, when she started coughing, I thought, when I was coming back, great ploy. Somebody ought to pass this on to people, cough and need water and turn purple. But it wasn't. It was just, it was accidentally happened. I think one of the things, or what I do to deal with this kind of client, or this kind of atmosphere of the unempowered client and the unentitled client, is to move them toward a more proactive stance in their own search. I mean, I know that I have a lot of information, and that legally I can't, and I don't, just automatically say, well, here are your names, and here's your file, and go on your way. But that I can give them some suggestions on what to do. This is really the counseling aspect, I think, of what I do. I ask them not only how I can help, but what they think they can do. What are some other sources of information that they can go to? Who can they ask? I tell them that there are screw-ups all over the place, in churches, in governments, and if they keep asking people for things, somebody might slip and give them stuff, and that they really ought to do that for themselves. I also try to get them to tell their whole story right away, with all the emotional baggage that goes with it. And one of the reasons that I don't self-disclose right away is that I think that really shortcuts their dealing with their feelings. If they think, I'm an adoptee, then I know how they feel, and that they don't really have to go through the process of being that open with what they say. So I have them tell their story, I have them rage at the agency, and will reflect that feeling back to them. It was a terrible thing that nobody gave you any knowledge of where your child was placed. It's a terrible thing that you went through life thinking that your birth mother never cared about you. Why didn't somebody, why wasn't somebody there helping you? Why wasn't the agency more sensitive to that? And really, in a way, kind of validate their feelings about that. Because I think, as you said, I don't think it's displaced anger to be angry at the agency. Or the agency's representative. And I mean, I can really take that. It's okay to be angry. And in fact, I think that frees them up to deal with the more underlying angers that they may have about other things in their life. If they can feel that they're justified in feeling that way. And to me, I mean, a lot of adoptees, and I went through this, and you probably went through this, have a tremendous difficult time with anger. Of all the feelings that we have, I think it's the hardest to be direct about, even though it will come out in a lot of other ways. I also try to offer, but not insist that they take, the services of the agency. In other words, come back a couple of times in the course of their search or not search, and deal with some of the feelings. I try to be real clear that this is not therapy. I don't do the kind of in-depth work that Mary Ellen does, but I end up doing a lot more of it than I thought I would, because a lot of adoptees who have been in therapy or been in some kind of mental health counseling in their lives have had a hard time finding someone who really will listen to the adoption part of their work and really take it seriously and really attend to it. Number of clients I've had who've been through 2 or 3 or 4 therapists and feel like they need to talk to someone that they know will take their adoption issues seriously. And even if they don't know I'm an adoptee, they know I work at an adoption agency, and they know that we can focus on this issue in this place. I do have a list of referrals that I've been building, I've been collecting, either people who are triad members or people who are sympathetic to and interested in adoption issues to have for people who really are interested in doing ongoing therapy. And that's a list that's building slowly, but it's, I think it's important to have that, because I've had training as a therapist and I've worked as a therapist, but that's not what I'm supposed to be doing at this agency, and it's not really what I want to do. Even though a lot of the things that you talked about, transference and countertransference issues come up, and I think that's one of the things that I think about when I think of using myself in the job that I do and my own experience in the job that I do, that there are transference, countertransference issues that come up even if you're not defining what you do as therapy and you're not being psychoanalytic about it. I think there is a tendency to identify with and want to nurture and want to help and maybe want to counsel and advise clients that you feel real maternal bonds with. There's also the identification often with people once they know where I am, identification with me, or birth parents who have never met adoptees who really kind of need to have an adoptee that they adopt until, whatever they've done in terms of completing their search. And so there's a lot of the same kinds of issues that do come up. I had the opportunity to design services for this agency, which, as it turns out, were never implemented because of a change in leadership at some point. But it was fun trying to anticipate what some of the needs of this population would be. And I looked at it very much in terms of a developmental perspective and very much in terms of having the beginning part of the process inform what post-adoption services would be and vice versa. What I learned from my post-adoption clients is very helpful in working at the early stages with home studies and with pregnant women who may or may not relinquish, and what really they need, no matter what their choice is. And so I tried to at least put into memo form anyway, in telling the agency what I thought we needed to do in terms of support groups that really begin for parents at the point of placement and go and are available to parents throughout the life cycle. I think sometimes there are groups for parents that are real good when the children are very, very young, but when the children are 5 and 6 and 7 and into latency and into adolescence, parents are less likely to want to identify maybe with other adoptive parents and sort of get on with their own family and not really have to deal with this. At a time when I think maybe children need that, maybe need, even if it's just a kind of social component, to get together with other families with adoptive children. And because I've worked a lot with families who are adopting Asian children, I think that's even more important for those kinds of adoptive families. Because at the point at which children start seeing themselves and their family as being different from other children they might play with or other families that they might know, that's the point at which I think families really need to be together on that. So that's one of the things that I wanted to put in there. I also wanted to have groups that would be post-relinquishment groups for birth mothers who might be at different stages, but who could be really start as kind of a self-help group that would then go on and be available to other mothers. And for adoptees themselves at different ages. I did, before I was a social worker, I did an adoptee group at the school where I taught, and there were anywhere from 8 to 25 people that would meet regularly, and it was a very normalizing experience for them to be together. And I think agencies could very often offer that as a possibility. Yeah.
What level school was that?
High school. And it was actually mostly the people who were very interested in it were the 16, 17-year-olds who I think were at that point in their lives where they really felt confident enough to talk about being adopted in front of other people and needed that group support rather than feeling like it was something they didn't want to be different from other people, and if they didn't talk about it, they could pretend they were just like everyone else. But it seemed like it was the juniors and seniors mainly that were interested in that. I also think that it's important for people with adoption experience to work with people who are clinicians, researchers, educators in some way, as kind of an ongoing dialogue. I mean, I think I have learned a great deal from the clinical population I've seen in therapy and from talking to therapists about their clients. But I think therapists also can learn a lot about adoption issues from people who work in agencies with people at various stages of the adoption process. So I think that's another important component of what post-adoption services in an agency really should be. In 1980, a woman named Linda Kay wrote an article about post-adoption counseling as a preventive mental health specialty, and she said many of the same things, that there's an ongoing sense of what we learn from post-adoption clients, should be kind of a key to reforming current practice, and that we can certainly learn in areas of family building with adoptive families, and with children at various ages of their development, and with adults. That there's really an ongoing process of back and forth in which, both ends of the spectrum can be improved by some sense of having a specialty in this area. Let's see, what do I want to say? Oh, with the self-disclosure thing, I may have already talked about what my feelings. I think it's a very good idea. I think it's a very valuable experience when you're an adoptee to finally meet other people who share your experience. And I think one of the things that can happen when you meet an adoptee in an agency is that you feel this instant empathy, and you feel heard, and you feel listened to. And that's a very good thing, but as I said, it can really shortcut the process of being able to get your story out and get your feelings that surround that story out as well. I usually, again, recommend that adoptees be part of a search and support group, whether they're searching or not, because there they will really have a much better opportunity to dialogue on issues that concern them, and feel that there are people like them in the world or at the stage that they are. If people ask me directly, I tell them that I'm adopted. If they say, well, are you an adoptee? And I'll say yes. I mean, I won't lie about it or prolong it, but I had to fight not to have agency staff who were doing intake calls to immediately say, well, you need to talk to Nora Reep. She's our resident adoptee, and she knows all about this, and she knows just how you feel. This was really hard. I mean, I'd get telephone calls from saying, I understand that you know just how I feel. And I'd say, no, I have no idea how you feel. Tell me about it. But I think it can be also very inhibiting because people come, I certainly came to my agency with a lot of anger after I'd had numerous phone calls where they wouldn't talk to me when I was searching. I think people need to be free to be that angry about it, and you feel like, if you have the resident adoptee in front of you, how can you really yell and scream and curse at that person, because they're fellow sufferers, they're fellow victims, they know how you feel. And so I would rather not have them pull their punches right away. I like to have people coming in, loaded for bear, and they really want to talk about what maybe their prior contacts with the agency has been. As I guess you were mentioning, numerous times I would go to files and there would be letters from adoptees within the last maybe 3 or 4 years, and letters from birth parents in the same period of time, wanting to meet each other. No indication in the file that anything was ever done. And letters would come in, and letters would come in, and there'd be this whole stack of correspondence from the mid-'80s. Nobody had done anything except send them the usual form letter that we are forbidden by Public Law 282-34 from revealing any identifying information. So we can't tell you if anybody has contacted the agency looking for you. And they would come in angry. I mean, you figure 5 years of correspondence and nothing, So fine, be angry. I was angry with them. I thought it was terrible. But it was very important for me, and I think very important for clients, to get to a point where they felt they could be real, where they weren't hiding behind correct motivational material or correct, nice adoptee, well-mannered, just give me anything you can and I'll be nice and I'll go away and I won't cause any problems. that's not a real encounter, and it really serves nobody's best interests. So what we would do, what I would try to do is use the sort of be the agency representative, be the person that they could talk to, and then listen to their story, and then move from there whatever direction that they wanted to go in, and share their frustrations at the fact that we were working in a closed record system and that things were really unfair. But at least leave them with the sense of where they might feel more powerful, where they might feel like they had at least gotten some of their needs taken care of, and they could go forth, and there was something that they could do with the material they had. I want to present one kind of little, well, actually it's 3 cases, but it really is one case. It's an interesting triangle, a birth mother, an adoptee, and the birth mother's daughter by her marriage. All of whom, and I didn't expect this to happen, but I actually saw all 3 of them in a relatively short period of time. The birth mother was a woman who was now 44, who had had a child at the age of 14, and was coming back because she wanted to put a letter in the file. This is, I think, the birth mother's politically correct thing. I just want to put a letter in the file, letting them know that I'm in good health and that I'm available if they want to find me. So she did this. In listening to her story, it turned out that the minute that she was diagnosed as being pregnant, her parents shipped her off to the maternity home. At some point when she was about 6 months pregnant, it was the summertime, and the family had rented a beach cottage, and they said, to her, wouldn't you like to come and be with us for a couple of weeks, get out of the maternity home where you've been for 6 months. So they brought her there at night, and she was allowed to go out of the house at night, but basically she was in the house the whole time. And she's telling the story like this is a perfectly kind of normal thing, and this is the way things work. She, as it turned out, was also she's a twin, and her sister was the smart one, and she was the dumb one. I think getting pregnant at 14 kind of fed into that feeling of this was kind of a dumb thing to do. So she's the dumb one. It turns out, I said, well, you don't seem dumb to me. She's a tax attorney. She's a wonderful woman, and her sister's a paralegal, the twin sister. But her sister is still the smart one, and she's the dumb one. And being a paralegal is good, but it seems to me that she did advance farther than the dumb one ought to have. Her big issue coming to me was that she wanted a piece of information from the file that had always made her feel guilty, and that was that she forgot the day that her child was born. She couldn't remember actually anything around that period of time. There was about 3 weeks that had just fallen out of her life at that point, and she thought if her child ever finds her, she knew that the child's fantasy would be that every day on her birthday her mother remembered, and and she didn't want her daughter ever to know that she forgot the day that she was born. So I told her that because I figured that most people do know that. Her parents had forbidden her to see the baby, and she also felt guilty because she disobeyed them, and she did see the baby.
This marks the end of Session 9, Part 1. Please turn to Session 9, Tape 2.
This was the first that she'd heard. This was, I guess, a Thursday I saw her. She went away. She called me up on Monday and said, I really want to come in and talk to you. I went away for the weekend. First time in my life, I just spent 2 days crying and really mourning this. And I think that's a lot of what you were saying in terms of having to have things maybe be real before you can mourn them. And interestingly enough, the day after this is getting ahead of me, but the day after she came in for the first time, there was a letter from her daughter that came in asking for assistance in finding her birth mother. Now, these 2 women have, been very much on track all along. So, in retrospect, it didn't surprise me this happened. But when she came in on Monday, I was really excited. And I said, she talked about all this grief, and I couldn't really get a word in edgewise. And I thought, fine, she wants to talk about this is great. She's actually feeling it because she really impressed me as being, this very smiling, kind of numb person when I first met her, and she really wanted to talk about it. And she said, it doesn't feel numb anymore. I don't know if this is better or not because, you know, I'm actually feeling something and it's not a real happy feeling. And I said, well, it's a real feeling. And so when she finally stopped talking about that, she said, well, what do I do now? And I said, well, we got a couple of options here. Got a letter from your daughter on Friday. And we can do this a number of ways. I can't, because of the laws of the District of Columbia, I can't really just put you together, even though this is what you both want. But what I can do is put you both in touch with the local reunion registry and alert the people who run the reunion registry that a match is going to be coming, and they should be alert to it. Or you can go through court, which appealed to the lawyer in her, I think, and open the records legally, and the agency will sue on your behalf. You have to pay for it, or you can write up the legal stuff, but we'll do it for you. This is the only way we can do it. And she said, well, I think I really want some more time, and I think I want someone to put us together. I want to use basically what we now call an intermediary system to do this. And she said, I know this is going to take like 6 weeks, 8 weeks to get through court. So can we use that time to talk about stuff I haven't had a chance to talk about? And I said, fine, we'll do that. And we had several more sessions talking about what a reunion would mean, what she fantasized, how she really had to think about this baby as being a 30-year-old woman, and what that meant. She also needed to think about her family. Her husband knew about this baby because they had the birth father, Anne, and her husband had been classmates in high school, so he knew all about that. And they had to figure out, how they were going to tell their children. And she had 2 children, yeah, a boy and a girl, that that this had happened early in Anne's life, and so that it seemed like this might be a good time to kind of do all that work. And there was difficulty with the husband because all of this kind of brought up a very painful period in his life when he loved her, but she was going out with the birth father and became pregnant by him, and all of those sorts of things came back even after 23 or 25 years of marriage. There was a lot of work that he had to do, and he came in one time and we talked about this together, and he didn't want to be shut out of the reunion, but he also didn't want Anne talking about it a lot to their friends. She was all ready to shout it from the rooftops, and he said, no, I don't really want you to do that. We've got to go slow because of the kids and because of me, and I'm having problems. And she felt like it's just like my parents again, making me go out in the dark at the beach because they couldn't be seen, and there's nothing to be ashamed of now. And so there was considerable talking back and forth between the two of them, and with the children later on. But that's another story, and I'll get into it in a second. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, the adoptee was also coming in periodically. And what was weird is that she would show up in the reception area, and she looks exactly like her birth mother. And the receptionist, who likes to pride herself on knowing all the clients and being able to address them by name, Janet came in, she said, hi, Anne, weren't you just here yesterday? And I said, afterwards, I said, Sylvia, don't do that anymore, because this is not Anne, this is Anne's daughter. So she knew right away that she looked like her mother, which was something that she really wanted to know. And so we did a lot of talking about what she wanted to share with the birth mother during this time before they did meet, and what her feelings were. She was married with 3 children, and had a very happy family life, was a very together kind of girl. Her brother and sister, who were also adopted, were not really together. And both of them were really hostile toward her when she started searching, because they thought, you're going to hurt our mother. Their father was dead, had died of, forget what it was that he had, but it was a long, very prolonged death. And the adoptee was really kind of the primary caretaker, because her mother just kind of fell apart when all of this happened. So they felt very protective toward the adoptive mother. The adoptive mother had no problems with the reunion taking place. except she didn't really realize this meant an ongoing relationship, so there were problems later. But in any case, the adoptee, had a very similar kind of story to her birth mother's. And this I found was not uncommon in dealing with adoptees. She became pregnant as a teenager and married the father instead of, although her family was saying, why not choose adoption? She just didn't feel that she could do that because she didn't want to sever possibly the only biological connection she might have. But she talked about, and she was very happy, she was a good mother, she had 2 children after that, strong marriage, just really had a very good life and was very happy, but periodically she would become seized up with just uncontrollable depression and a feeling of emptiness, and this was really what prompted her to search in the first place. And she always felt that, she referred to it as kind of feeling vibes from her birth mother, and around the time that Anne was calling me and making an appointment to come in, and I'm sure it was in the same week when we later talked about it, she said she was driving along in the car and said, and she'd written many previous letters to the agency and really had not gotten anywhere with them, and finally she said, I was driving along and I said out loud, I don't know how to find you, you've got to find me. Mm-hmm. So it was really kind of spooky in a way when they finally did meet. We had the reunion then some time after that, usually after the six weeks that we predicted. And it was the first time I'd been involved in seeing a birth mother and adoptee meet for the first time, and it was a very moving experience for me. It was really almost traumatic because I really was so involved with both of them. And they hit it off right away, and they were perfect. Both of them came wearing blue jeans, a white turtleneck, and a red sweater.
Oh, God.
Their handwriting was exactly the same. I mean, it was incredible. They spent about 4 hours at the agency with each other. Anne's husband came about the last half hour to meet Janet, and they set up a time to get together. Meanwhile, Janet's husband already knew, but Janet's children were told that there was someone they weren't told that this was a grandmother, but that this was someone who was going to be very special in their life. These kids were at an age where understanding relationships of any kind was difficult. And so, the plan was not to keep from them this was their grandmother, but that it would be introduced gradually so that they could, deal with the 2 grandmothers they had plus this new grandmother. But more difficult was Anne's children, telling Anne's children. The boy was fine. He was very happy to have another sister. And he had no problems with it. Anne's daughter had a very difficult time with it. She was being supplanted, as she saw it, as the daughter. Plus, it was very painful for her to realize that Janet looked just like her mother, and she didn't look anything like either of her parents, really. And that Janet came with 3 grandchildren for her mother, and the daughter has had trouble conceiving, hasn't had a child yet. So it was like, this wonderful person has come into my mother's life, and Anne was, of course, glowing, as one would be. So I suggested that Karen might want to come in, never thinking that she would, because, adoption was something that probably was not a real happy topic for her, considering her own infertility, and plus this adoptee, this golden girl comes along with everything. Also better educated, everything, she was better. So we talked about that. We spent an hour talking about that, and she was probably the most together person of the 3 of them. She's very direct in her feelings, angry as hell. She said, I know, I'm 23 years old, and I've got sibling rivalry, and maybe it's easier when you're 5 and you can bop someone on the head and feel better, but now here I am, and I have to be civilized and have to be nice, and I love my mother, but we've had all these conflicts. It was like 8 therapy sessions in 45 minutes, and I said, well, one of the things we might do is have, you and Janet talk to each other without your mother here. and really kind of get your feelings out. And she said, fine. You know, and I thought, oh, here we go. They're going to put up the ring and get out the gloves. Meanwhile, talking to Janet, it turned out that what her fantasy was that her adoptive family and her birth family would all be friends. You know, it was kind of neat for her that her husband and Ann's husband liked the same kinds of things and did the same kind of work, and everybody liked country music, and all of that was it. But she wanted the families to kind of blend, kind of with herself at the center. It's very, you know, it seemed to me a very narcissistic kind of wish that all of these people who loved her would also love each other, and they would all kind of circle around her. Well, that wasn't going to happen, and it became really apparent, particularly with Karen, that this was going to be a real difficult thing, and she wanted Karen to like her, and you know, and Karen was predisposed to want to like her too, but this was all happening so fast. So they talked, and they had another kind of one of these 8-session things in 50 minutes, and I don't think they're ever going to be best friends, but I think they are getting along well. And it struck me when I was dealing with all these cases and when I was thinking about them in preparation for coming here today, that dealing with an adoptee is never a kind of one-shot deal, that you really are dealing, maybe not as extensively as this, but you're always dealing with the whole system and the sort of extended adoption family when anyone comes in the room. So counseling to search or not, you know, I don't do that. But when a search happens, I realize I'm really dealing with a great deal of people, and that's one of the things that the adoptee really has to work on, that, you know, you don't just find a birth mother, you find a whole world out there. And really the post-search work is certainly as important and certainly more extensive than the decision to search in the first place. Do you want to read your story?
Great.
Okay.
Thanks. I'm just going to read this by way of finishing our piece, and then hopefully we can have some dialogue about all this. This is written by a 13-year-old client that I see, and she's given me permission to read it here, and I've promised her a tape. So she's an adoptee who I've been seeing for 5 or 6 months. And she has a lot of questions and a lot of thoughts about searching and about her story. So she wrote this, and it's called The Voice of an Adopted Child. I am inside a wonderful place. It is warm, and I feel the loving care of another human. I hear a beautiful, warm voice. Now I feel secure. I rely on this human to bring me into the real world. What is happening? I am moving. I can begin to see light. It's cold. Please, very special person, keep me warm. Soon I hear a very loud noise. It's my cry. Somebody keep me warm. I am placed into a very beautiful woman's arms. I hear the same voice that I've heard in the past. I feel protected. I feel this is my mother. This feeling did not last for very long. After I was cleaned up, I was put into a moving box. When the box stopped, I was handed and carried into a building and handed to a lady wearing black and white. She held me, but still it was not the same. I was given food, toys, and shelter, but still something was missing. Where was that woman, my mother, whom I depended on for all that time? Why isn't she here when I cry? Does she know where I am, or maybe she just doesn't care? It seems as though I've stayed in this place called an orphanage forever. It was 6 months to be exact, although, as I am told, I was born on April 29th, 1976, and stayed until November 24th, 1976, when a man and a woman came in and said that they wanted a very special little girl. A nice lady in black and white came in and brought me out. Our eyes met, and the lady was smiling, but crying just like I was. I got scared. What is wrong with me? Do I have something on my face? Is my hair too red? Are my eyes too blue? I wondered if this is what all my other friends that I've seen come and go went through. Why do I have to go through it too? I was placed in the woman's arms, and once again I felt protected, but unsure of what would happen next. Soon after, we all cried together. I don't know why they were crying, but I knew something was about to change in my life. And I thought to myself, does my mother know what's happening to me? Where is she? What is she doing now? Is she thinking of me? Before I knew it, I was back in this moving box with the same man and lady I had just seen. Where are we going? Soon we arrived at a big white building. I was carefully carried out of the car and into the building where many people were standing, teary-eyed again, looking at me. Again, I asked myself what was wrong with me. I was passed around from arm to arm, but still, even though they were all very caring and very nice, something was missing. After a while, things got quiet. I think I fell asleep. I stayed in this home for a very long time. Day after day after day, the people became family. They gave me love, food, shelter, and anything else I needed. They were all I could ever ask for, but still, something was missing. It was as if I were to put a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle together and coming to the end and finding one piece missing. Now I am old enough to speak and understand their language. It is snowing out and I am watching television. It is lunchtime and my mom and dad and I are sitting at the table. My mom begins to speak. "Annie, today is a very special day." "But why, Mommy?" I asked. I think I might have said something wrong because she began to cry. She said, 3 years ago today, your father and I brought you home from the adoption agency." "But what's an adoption agency, Mommy?" "It's a place where a lot of babies are born to people who didn't think they could take care of a baby, and babies stayed there until someone came along who could take care of them." "But why and who and—" I have many questions that my real mommy can't answer, but she tries. I have too many questions that only that woman could answer. Many years have gone by. I'm a big girl now. I don't remember a day that I haven't thought about my biological mother. My birthdays aren't my favorite times of year either. I wonder if she thinks of me on that day. I wonder if she regrets that day. I wonder if I have been replaced. I know the woman I'm living with now is my real mother, and she has always been the one there for me, and the other lady is only the woman that has answers to my questions. Someday I hope to meet her, not to live with her, but only to get medical background information and other information that I may need for the future. After all, nobody can do what my mom has been doing for me. Nobody. I thought that was a good way to sort of sum up, because it really sort of encapsulates a lot of what we've been talking about today. And we want to open it up. There's not a lot of time, but there's some time for questions and discussion and feedback and thoughts. So
That's really fascinating, what you just read, especially coming from someone that young. It's so perceptive.
Yep.
That she recognized that she had memories, even though they weren't verbal, language messages.
Yep.
It was some way it was coded into their cells or something that gave them that information. I work for Hope Cottage in Dallas, Texas, and we have just recently did an 8-week adult adoptee group, which really is just sort of a pilot project because we really had never done it before, so we didn't know what would work and what wouldn't and what the needs were. But we didn't want to call it a therapy group because we didn't really want to scare people off, because I think too many adoptees have heard the word therapy and it's been used in reference to adoptees so often that it's like, oh, no more of that, And so really what we tried to do was set it up as a self-growth process, working all the way from conception through each developmental stage up to where they are right now, and discussing the possibility of search and need and what all that means. We had one woman in the group who was 27, and we asked them, which we had no idea what was going to happen, but we asked them if they would write a story about their conception and the time they spent in the womb and their birth, and how they felt right after the birth. And this woman was able to do it. It was just miraculous. She must have really tuned in and been able to just pull things out of herself that she never knew were there. But it was very much like that, but she was much more descriptive about the time in the womb and the sensations of being there and the experience of what her mother was going through and even things she was doing, that was affecting the child at the time. And the pain of being yanked away from this woman that she had all this safety and security with right at birth and was, moved off very quickly into another room where there was no physical contact between them. Part of this is information, of course, she's gained from a reunion experience, so that she was able to kind of piece things together and feel part of it, but some of it was actual factual information she had. There was only one other woman in the group that was able to do it. We had 7 adult adoptees there, and only one other woman was able to do it, and it was not nearly as perceptive as that was. So I think that's very, very difficult to do, and but I do think it is an excellent therapeutic tool and an opportunity to kind of relive that and go through it again.
It's fascinating to me because, again, the experience happened at a time, obviously it was pre-verbally, but I believe the body carries memories and
Yes.
how people can then access that. And there's been some work written, or things talked about in terms of using body work to access pre-verbal memories, but I think it's fascinating
Well,
stuff.
I had never even heard about this. I mean,
Yeah.
I've heard about memories being stored in cells and so forth,
Yeah.
but I thought it was memories that we had consciously,
Mm.
you know, and we had some language skills at the time it happened. But through the group, one of the adoptees that came brought a book called Babies Remember,
Mm.
which I'd never seen before. And I got a chance to read through some of that, and that's exactly what they were talking about, is that very thing, is we have all those memories.
Sounds like a great group.
Somewhere. Oh, it was a marvelous
Yeah.
group. The last night was the night before I came up here, and I was almost in tears. It was like, we have to stop this.
Yeah, yeah.
So we're gonna keep doing it. We're gonna do more cruise.
Great, that sounds good. Penny?
Mary Ellen, did your 13-year-old do that in response to your request, or did she take her own initiative?
No, she did it. She actually wrote it for an English project and turned it in at school and then said, I should probably tell you about this, you know. And then she brought it in and read it to me. And then I asked her whether or not, I told her I was coming to a conference, and said, how would you feel I could disguise, you know, your name or whatever? And she said, no, that's okay, you know, you can say Annie. And she got it typewritten for me, and yeah. And felt actually I asked her, I just saw her yesterday before I left from Providence, and said, how are you feeling about me reading this? And she said, I think I feel okay about it. I'm wondering how people are going to react. And I said, I'll bring you a tape and I'll let you know. So, yeah. So no, it wasn't in response to, I mean, it would be a great idea to actually use it as a therapeutic tool, but she came up with it by herself. She's very bright, just, yeah.
I have a question. A 27-year-old woman came to me. I'm an agency person too, and what we do is share non-identifying information, and if they do want to search, what we do is try to seek out that other member. But if we can't, then we refer them, legally we need to, what we do is refer them to a search group and try to give them as much information as we can. She came to me with her parents. Both her parents came. And she said to me, well, I had a cancer on my leg and I want medical information. So I tried as much as I could with her parents there, and I gave her the non-identifying information. And part of that information was that her birth mother stated that she was sexually assaulted. And we gave her that information. When she read it, first thing she said is, I'm nothing like her. She's very angry at her birth mother. So when I said, sounds like you're real angry, she said, oh no, as she's crying. And her adopted mom is shaking her head, yes, but she wouldn't really, and also she found out that she has her birth mother also placed a brother 2 years before she was placed, and found out about him. And what she wanted me to do is try to seek out the brother, because she really would like to meet him. Try to seek out the mother, but doesn't want to meet her. She just wants medical information. I'm having a hard time trying to empower her, because she's very good adoptee that she's, every time she would say something to me, she'd look at her family to make sure that she wasn't hurting them and making them feel uncomfortable, even though it looked like they were very supportive in whatever route she chose.
Did you ask her why she brought her parents with her?
No, not with them. She said she wanted to because her mom has been very involved and
Oh, I see.
supportive
Oh, okay.
with her throughout the whole thing. I'd like to see her alone. I'm having a hard time getting her to come in. Again, I can't force her to do this. So I did what I promised, is that I tried to contact birth mother, of course. The address was 30 years old. That letter came back. But I did get a lead on her brother that I'm trying to follow up with. I'm concerned about her not, it sounds like she said that she started seeing a psychologist. And I asked her, does this psychologist have adoption experience, and they work with other adoptees, and she didn't know that. What do you suggest, or can you, or?
I think it's difficult. I think it's difficult because although obviously I'm a therapist, I'm very sort of pro-therapy, I also am the first one to get up when legislation is proposed that says that counseling or therapy should be any piece of people, you know. So I think it's difficult. I mean, and again, I'm not in that kind of setting, but I think it's difficult when we so clearly see a need for work around this piece, but yet unless the person asks or wants, it's really difficult. I mean, perhaps you could, if she wanted or whatever, you could offer to, I don't know, talk to the psychologist to meet with her, but ultimately, yeah.
I would, you know, I mean, I think the most you can do is try to stay in contact with her and keep her coming. You know, and, you know, see what you can do, see what kind of openings that she gives you. I think, you know, if she doesn't want it, there's nothing you can do, or if she is backing away from it. But it sounds like, you know, it might help to
I've been trying to complete what I've
explore
planned.
that material with her anyway, the non-identifying information, explore it more and her feelings around it.
And I did try, but, and again, her parents were sitting there too.
That's very inhibiting.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And
It feels like your parents are sitting there. I mean, you know, I feel that it's nice when you have supportive adoptive parents, and I'm really in favor of that, but sometimes it's hard just to talk to the adoptee if they're there.
And I am, you know, but I am trying to follow through on what I promised
Uh-huh.
to do. And I again, talked to her verbally about joining a support group, and also that I wrote a letter to say, this is just a follow-up, and this is what I'm doing. And I gave her the number of the support groups, but I guess that's all I can do.
And it's
Yeah.
incredible to me sometimes when people even, you know, will call about the support group or whatever, and it won't be 6 months, a year, 2 years later, and they come back, you know.
Maybe she's not ready.
Yeah, she might be at a point.
Yeah, there's an awful lot of that sort of approaching and then going back, and approaching and going back.
Yeah.
Can I say something about it?
Sure.
I think that there would be problems for her to speak in front of the parents.
Mhm.
I'm a family therapist, and I think you may be really having an opportunity because they did come. And I think that I wouldn't start out talking about all that other information that she might be really hesitant about. But I think she should talk directly with them about what it means to be doing this. And I don't think it's coincidence that they came.
Right.
You know, and her issues are like the flip side of their issues. And that might be really why they're all there. It would be, to me, it'd be a shame for them to take advantage
Yeah.
of that.
Mhm.
If they turn that down and they move away, then you haven't
Yeah.
lost anything, but, you know.
She also, her adopted mom has her birth mother's name,
Mhm.
and she doesn't want it. Her adopted mom said, I have it, here it is. I don't want it, I don't need it.
I think that's a really good point, that's a real, potentially a real window of opportunity to,
And here, I'm not technically a therapist either. I do pre-adoption, work with pre-adopted families, and because of an agency, like a staff, and, you know, some person handles it, and they give me the, so I don't want to do something that
Right.
I'm not. So
Right.
that's what I've been.
yeah.
Yeah, but she has her mom, her adopted mom says, here's the name, you can have it, here's your adoption decree. Don't want it.
Not yet. Huh.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I work in a group home with children that have been adjudicated dependent by the court system, either because of physical abuse, sexual abuse, or neglect. And they lived with their birth parents for at least the first 5 years of their lives.
Mhm.
And now they're in a case called special needs children, adoptable or foster care. And my question to you ladies is, therapeutically, what techniques do you all use if you work with children like this? Because I'm having a very difficult time with these children that they're living in a fantasy and they don't want to go to the adoptive home. If they do go into the adoptive home, they'll be the extreme. They want to be terrible, test them, will you give me up to, you know, are you going to hit me? You know, they carry that label, I was abused, so abuse me.
I think it's very difficult. I actually had some notes about that, and I was writing that I think it's such a difficult thing that we ask kids to do sometimes, is to have, you know, lived with a birth family, and really, I mean, the loyalty issues I think are there for all adoptees anyway, but certainly you live with your birth family, and it doesn't matter. I mean, it almost sometimes makes the bond stronger when there's been abuse or there's some, you know, that's how love gets equated. And I think that we ask kids to do really difficult things, and that my reference to talking about grieving and mourning and loss, and that it's very difficult for kids to grieve, and to ask kids in some ways to grieve and mourn and let go of and deconnect from the parents, and then to be able to move on, I think is a real challenge. And are these kids that are officially completely terminated parental rights?
Some are and some aren't.
Uh-huh.
And with the ones that really are not, and they're in the foster home, get ready to be adopted. You know,
Mhm.
sometimes they'll bring them in and they want to see their birth parents again, and we can have visitations
Right.
supervised, and I'll supervise them.
Right.
And they see the contrast of the two different environments. Here they're in a nice home, they're giving them shelter, nurturance, schooling, food,
Right.
and where they see their natural parents are still in the dumps, you know, they don't even care, alcoholics, drug addicts, whatever.
Mhm.
And still they say, I don't care that I have all this, I
Yeah.
want to be with
Yeah.
them.
It's a powerful
Maybe
bond.
now I can help them that I have these new skills or that I've seen something
Right.
different.
I think in those, I mean, and also in even infant adoptions, but particularly in those situations, that disconnection from the first family doesn't make any sense to me. And that because I think birth parents are internalized. I mean, especially at 5 or 6 or 7, those parents are now living inside of those kids, so it doesn't matter if they never physically see them again, they're there, and they have representations of them inside. And I think a lot of the work has to be to really be doing life review stuff and working on what those years were like early on, and to help them to develop a more realistic picture, but also to look for any strengths in the birth family, because I think the more that you can build up on the strengths of even any member of the birth family, even if there's a great
Well,
grandfather.
they look at all the strengths. I mean, even if they
Uh-huh.
don't have any strengths,
Yep.
they'll tell you, oh, she was
They're
this,
pretty
he was that,
idealized.
I mean, he was a
Yeah.
professional, and then we look
Yeah.
at the life book, we go back, and I use a lot of reality therapy.
Yeah.
Where's the nice car that you said he had in your nice home? And we go back to the
Yeah.
home where he was raised, or she
Yeah.
was raised. And, oh, they must have lost it all, or, she
Mhm.
got involved with drugs, and they'll give you fantasies after fantasies.
Now, I wonder what would happen if you took, I mean, it's not reality therapy, but if you took the other position, sort of to say, to go along with their, again, fantasy about the fact that they were these good, wonderful, whatever people, and whether or not that would, because I think sometimes the kids feel like they have to defend their parents against
Oh, of course.
the reality of, whoa, life wasn't so great.
Mhm.
So if there's a way that there can be open, I mean, what other thoughts, are there
Yeah,
other thoughts too
yeah.
about that? But
You use life books, and
Yeah.
what kind of transition is there from the foster home to the adoptive home?
Could be from a year or two, sometimes 9 months.
And do they
We're
have
gradually introducing the adoptive parents more and more.
Well, usually the foster parents are the adoptive parents.
Oh,
Mm.
oh, okay.
We like to make that transition if possible, that's the
Uh-huh.
ideal.
Uh-huh.
But then we have that they go into foster home with those expectations, but the children are so unattached, they don't care, they don't want to be there. I mean, first 6 months or 9 months, the honeymoon period where, oh, they love it, they're the
Yeah.
best. I love you, Mom and Dad, right away, and then forget it.
Have the adoptive parents met the birth parents in these situations?
I believe in two, in my caseload, at least 2.
Because that might
They were
also
very
be.
threatening for them, but, these are twins. One of the girls loves
Yeah.
and has this fantasy. And the other one, the smart one, she says, oh, come on, I'll change names. But she'll say, come on, you know that's not true.
Yeah, yeah. Because that might be another potential piece of work that could be done. I mean, one of the things, I did a lot of work in foster care, and they would often set up foster parents against biological parents. So they were like the good parents and the bad parents.
I have
And
children
that,
do that.
yeah, that if they could meet, and that the birth parents could ultimately say, you know what, I can't take care of you, but here's somebody that can. We're going to be in contact. Yes, I allow you to be in this family. And that the foster parents in exchange say, yeah, we're going to let you hold on to these people who are important to you, so that there doesn't have to be that splitting, that the kid doesn't have to hold on to that, that somehow I mean, it's pretty radical stuff. I mean, it's not stuff that happens, I don't think, generally in adoption. And I think that initially foster parents or adoptive parents can be very threatened by that. But I think, I mean, if they adopt the kids, they're adopting those birth parents. Maybe not literally, but certainly.
Especially foster
Internally.
parents that take that route, because they have to do visitations, they have to
Yep.
take
Yeah.
them in,
Yeah.
to supervise.
It also helps too if there are siblings around, if efforts are made, and siblings that are adopted in other families sometimes, if there's some effort made to keep them together,
Of course.
or to allow visitation, well, I certainly, a case that I worked with, a child was in a foster home from birth to age 5. The foster parents did not want to adopt him, and he was adopted by someone else. And over a period of about 1.5 years, we worked on transitioning him into the adoptive home. But the adoptive mother was wonderful in terms of making sure that he visited with the other children from the foster home, with his biological brother, with a number of people. The mother couldn't be found. We tried to find the mother at some point. partially because she was a possible Huntington's chorea victim, and we wanted to see what his physical risks would be and his brother's. But there was a real attempt to make a family for him that included all the components of his life, and I think that really worked, although he did mourn the foster parents and was angry because he didn't understand why they couldn't keep him. That his transition was smoother, knowing that he was bringing a lot of his baggage with him, and that was okay. And everybody worked on his life book, his adoptive mother, me, the social worker for the foster parent, everybody did. And it was, sort of like he brought this whole train of his life with him. It wasn't as abrupt a break.
It's difficult work. It's really,
It is.
Yeah, it is. It's very hard.
And the question that I always think about is when the ones that are not, they're not free for adoption, that the parents are still in performance agreement, they have to do a certain number of tasks in order to get the children back. And they don't do it, they comply halfway, and then the judge says, okay, we'll give you extended for 3 more months or 6 more months, however, continue visitations, and these children are really so
Yeah.
confused,
Limbo,
and
yeah.
they're attached to their mom, they'll forgive them if they beat them or abuse them physically or sexually. They want to go back home.
yeah.
But then the system's pulling them apart. I always ask myself, what if we just educate this dysfunctional family instead of having them go into an adoptive home
Right.
where they don't want to be there? And
Right.
statistics are these children, adopted children that know their birth parents and go into adoptive homes.
Yeah. A lot
It's
of,
not-
yeah, not real successful. A lot of times I also find that ultimately they don't end up living in a family, or they
When
can't
they're-
make it
once
in
they're 18, they're
families.
out.
Yeah.
The one, I'm talking about special needs children, the ones that have been adopted ages 7, 8, 9, 10.
Yeah.
If they're not out of their families by the time they're early teenagers
Right.
in an institution till
Yep.
they're 18.
Exactly.
Right.
That they can't actually live in
Which
right
I
families.
worked with for 10 years
Yeah.
in Texas in a children's home,
Mm.
20 teenage girls, and lots of them were in that situation.
Yeah.
And they chose it. They said, hey, I've had families,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what they choose.
It's like, what stupid people.
I mean, I work between the ages of 5 and 12,
and
and at 11 or 10, in fact, they're saying, oh, I just don't even bother getting me a family,
Right.
I just rather stay here. I
Right.
want to live here, I like it here, it's
Right.
safe.
Exactly. Exactly.
So I always wonder if we do try to educate these families,
Yeah.
if it will work out better for
Yeah.
everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it Penny?
I just wanted to go back briefly to the adoptee who can't wait to meet a sibling but doesn't want to deal with the birth mother, because
Uh-huh.
I've dealt with that a fair amount with people calling a search group. And so I haven't been the therapist, I've been the other adoptee on the end of the phone, and typically, and so I've been real direct, and I've said, have you thought what it might be like for your birth mother to find out that you want to know the brother, or you want information from her, but you don't want to meet her? And people have been astounded to think that that might hurt her feelings somehow, because they're so into feeling rejection from her. And that's why they don't want to deal with her, because they're so angry about the rejection. And when they start to think about how, wow, that might really hurt her feelings, because she really might want to know that I'm okay, it sort of breaks through the obsessing about meeting the sibling instead of the birth mother.
It's a good
Well,
point.
I think too that siblings are less threatening.
Uh-huh.
The search warrant. I mean,
Yep.
they didn't have anything to do with the other one being placed. in
Right, it's sort of
Yep.
neutral,
They
it's
feel
neutral
both.
ground.
Yeah.
And
both sort of
birth
have
birth
the same
fathers too, I
experience.
found, are often much more neutral than birth mothers, in my experience. That somehow it's like she's the one that
Yeah.
carried me. I mean, it's, it has a tinge of sexism there, but that somehow that even in reunions, that reunions with birth mothers can often be much more tumultuous, much more intense, much more sort of emotionally, connected. But that I've heard many adoptees talk about relationships with birth fathers just being easier, simpler, more, less ambivalent or less, yeah. It's interesting. Other thoughts or ideas or questions? I know we're over time, but,
Are we over time?
yeah.
Just sped by.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.